Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I am not Amanda. If you read the email that Amanda was teaching Torah study, I am not Amanda. But she is not feeling well, so I'm kind of a last minute fill in. So we'll see where we go, because I did not have. Yesterday is when I learned that I was leaving this morning. So, but it's funny that
plenty of time to prepare.
Do what?
Yeah, plenty of time to prepare.
Oh yeah, so much time. But it's okay. There's a lot to talk about, and actually, we had an interesting discussion in our small group this week, and I decided to use some of that. So Christina is the only one who probably will be able to tell that I'm reusing some material, but I think it's okay. It fits with this really well. So this portion, starting in Deuteronomy 26, we're kind of, as we reach kind of the end of Deuteronomy, we're kind of coming to the end of kind of what they call like the actual law, Torah section of Deuteronomy, which starts at like in chapter 12-ish, I think. Maybe before that, I can't remember now. And like 26 is kind of the end of that. And then we kind of get some like recap material and like kind of Moses' final exhortations as the Israelites are about to enter the land. So we're kind of in a transition point with this portion. I kind of just want to look at, like, there's some interesting things that we kind of just see. It's not a super long portion, but there's a lot in it. So, but even just from like a first glance type of look, there's a couple of things that kind of stand out to me. And one, it's like the example of Egypt and coming out of Egypt and remembering that they are people who have been brought out, that they were once slaves, that, all these things about Egypt is mentioned a couple of times with a lot of, to me, it seems a lot of emphasis of like, this is really important. You have to remember this. You have to, this is what you need to learn from that. And then we have really kind of a couple sections of blessings and curses. Because we have initially, like, there's all these curses listed out for people who at the end of chapter 27, who are kind of participating in certain types of sin. There's all these curses that are specified for that. And then we have blessings. In chapter 28, we have blessings and then curses. And what do you notice in chapter 28 about just at a glance as you flip, about the blessings, how the blessings are portrayed versus the curses? And I'm looking like generally, like even just like as you like flip through and look at where the headings are, what do you notice about the curse section as compared to?
The blessings are for obedience and the curses are for disobedience.
Yes, for sure. The curses are a lot longer. Isn't that interesting? Why?
That's what disobedience gets you.
That's what disobedience gets you. Yeah? Okay. Why else? Why do you think that there's so much more detail and so much more kind of space dedicated to the curses as opposed to the blessings?
Blessings are more easily absorbed. Curses are a harder sell.
Okay.
I just walked in, but yeah, your first question to me is, it's like raising children. You got to give them more warning. They don't listen the first.
Mm.
They don't listen the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And I should say people, not just children.
True. There are some things we don't grow out of, aren't there? Yeah, so maybe it's some of the trying to motivate, and also So, well, any other comments before I share all my thoughts? Because they do, in some sense, parallel, but then the curses kind of go further than the blessings, it seems.
Well, the curses also expound a lot more on what the sins are.
Right.
And so it's pretty intense when you're not following what the Lord is saying in its positive way, but the prescription as to how bad it can be negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think there's and I didn't write down the reference. Let's see if I can find it really quick. I don't know if I can find it this fast. Should have written it down. I didn't. But there's a verse somewhere in all these verses that basically says something along the lines of that Adonai found it. Verse 63. Just as Adonai rejoiced over you to do good and to multiply you, so Adonai will rejoice over you to ruin and destroy you. That's a challenging statement. He will rejoice to ruin and destroy you. So what do we do with that? Does God delight in bringing destruction and chaos and against his chosen people?
He delights to do his word, and he warned you, and if you do wrong anyway.
Mm-hmm.
There's always relief to get rid of something that's not fun to be in your presence.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like, if I don't like you, you leave my house. It's kind of nice that you left.
True.
Yeah.
And yet we also have to figure out how that works with this covenantal faithfulness, right? Because he has promised that he will be faithful to his people. So, and in this sense, like, we know that destroy doesn't necessarily, because we see this in other passages too, like, destroy doesn't mean complete annihilation and destruction. And, like, he's not going to completely, like, wipe out the people. He's promised not to do that. But he does, and really to read some of these sections, he'll scatter you among these people from one end of the earth to the other. Among the nations you will find no rest. And so we've seen some of this happen to Israel, right? So because he is a God, he has to keep his word. But it's interesting to read commentaries, particularly Jewish commentaries, about this verse, because they kind of just want to, like, sweep it under the rug a little bit. It's kind of funny. Because you don't really know what to do with this. He's going to rejoice over bringing ruin and destruction. But I think put in context, I think we have to see, like, he has to, and, like, he wants the obedience, right? Like, this is not his first choice, is to bring this, right? His first choice is that people would turn toward him, follow the Torah, live in relationship with him. But if they're not, he has to demonstrate that he's the God who keeps his word, that he does what he says he's going to do. So I don't know. It's a tricky one. It's hard to, like, there's, like, not a definitive, like, how do we understand this? I was reading one commentary, and which this is kind of, like, rejected because it's like, this is not what it says. But, like, there were some Jewish scholars that at one point were like, well, this that basically was saying, like, it's not God, that he's going to destroy the other nations, or he's going to bring. And it's like, but that's not what it says. It's, like, very much like we're trying to, like, keep God in this nice, like, really kind light. But it is his kindness to keep his word. So, I don't know. it's just one of those tension points that we have to hold, I guess. So we can think about that a little bit more as we go.
Well, can I say something?
Yeah.
So I think that it's going to happen exactly the same thing to us. We're not going to be happy when evil is going to be removed to the world, and we're not going to be happy seeing so many people going different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But God is definitely being serious when He says, "Hey, I am the way.
Yeah.
You guys need to follow me, otherwise there's going to be consequences." And last time I was talking to you guys, I used the word discipline. People don't understand this. Discipline is truly love. Like, really, really it is. God never wants us to be on the wrong path. That He doesn't want something bad for us. He wants us to be with Him, and He's perfect. There's nothing better than Him.
Mm-hmm.
So when we choose a different path, obviously it's not going to end up well. And He sees the suffering that we go through. And I think that's what we found. The evil is finally going to be removed. That's what He meant. The evil is finally going to be removed from me, from my people, and I'm going to rejoice for that.
Yeah.
Not exactly destroying anybody, but
Yeah.
removing the evil.
Yeah. And in the Deuteronomy section of curses here, it doesn't say this, but in at the end of Leviticus, when it lays out the blessings and curses, it as you read through the curse sections, like it kind of goes in phases, and it'll give a section, and it'll be like, so that your hearts will turn back. And it's not saying that in this passage, but I think it is. I don't know if you can say it's implied, but it's a similar principle. I think that is, that's the established pattern and the established heart, right? Is that He allows, like you're saying, the discipline. He allows the consequences with the purpose of turning our hearts back to the Lord. And we see that come in it, and and it goes into that a little bit more in a couple of the last chapters too. And of course, after the curses, he goes back and is reminding them of the covenant. And I think that's the core of what some of the purpose of this is to come back to the covenantal faithfulness. It's like if you remember that God is covenantally faithful to you, and then you hold up your part of the covenant, you're not really gonna have to worry about all this. But if you don't, He doesn't allow mixture. He doesn't allow, I think one of the overarching themes of the Bible as a whole, Old and New Testament, is you can't serve two gods. You can't serve the God of Israel and money and another God and insert here your other deity or whatever you're going to worship. So I think it comes down to this whole, that He doesn't allow mixture. The other question that comes up, I think, when we read through this, because I think, so interestingly also, and this is here's a random tidbit for you if you know this or don't know this, but this portion, from my understanding and what I've read in several sources, I haven't been to a service where this portion has been read, but that when they read the curses, they read them really fast and in a really quiet voice because it's so bad. And so they're kind of just trying to get through it, and they want to focus on the blessings, which is what we do, where we are. We want the good things. We don't want to deal with the bad things. But I think it's important, like we started out saying, just even as you kind of are flipping through and looking at the pages, the curses are about twice as long as the blessings. And so understanding, it's a weight, it's the weight of the Torah, I think, is another thing that we're supposed to take away from this. So a question that has kind of surfaced as I've been reading through this and thinking about this is it's just especially after you read all the curses and read all the consequences of what happens when you don't follow the Torah, then the question is well, why don't people just follow the commandments? Why don't people just do what God says? Right? Why not? Why don't people just do that?
We have this fallen nature, and if we're tempted to do, whatever the Lord said, we're tempted to do the exact opposite. We're stupid that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think possibly people don't, I mean, some of these curses are so horrendous that it's hard to conceive that, especially in this day and age of God's a God of love, God's a God of grace, and they look at these curses and they're like, surely God wouldn't do that.
Right.
Surely God wouldn't do that.
Mhm.
And so I think there's almost a level of disbelief on the curses.
Yeah, I think that that's a common one. I saw that come up several times in some things I was just reading, because it's like would he really do that?
And would it get
Well.
so bad that people would do some of the things that
Yeah.
the curses state?
Right.
Because you're thinking, eat your own kid? Nobody's gonna, there's this
Right,
mindset.
and yet there's other nations that are doing this, and so I think part of this is, and again, this goes back to like we are often not very well versed in other ancient cultures and practices, but the things often, like a lot of, especially when you go back to the end of chapter 27 and some of those things, like when it talks about lying with animals and things like that, we're like, what? But apparently that was common in some cultures, and so so some of these things have a direct correlation with like these are things that other nations do, and you're not to do them. But if you are kind of lured away, or enticed into some of this other pagan worship, this is the consequence for it, because you're going back to you can't serve the God of Israel and any other God, including yourself, right? Eric Simon, several years ago now, he taught a message, and I don't know when it was. It's been several years, but he talked about secular humanism and basically the idolatry of secularism in ourselves and how dangerous that is when it comes to serving God. Really, like you can't really have both. And so I always think of that when I come to some of this, because it's this idea that we are, and Dennis Prager phrases it this way, and this is one of the things I like about his commentaries, and often with his commentaries lately, I've kind of landed at this point with some of his thought process of like, I like his thought process. I don't always end at the same conclusion, but I like his perspective, and it's very practical. I mean, that's why he calls his commentary series the Rational Bible. Is like he's like, this is practical and still applicable and still has impact. It has impact on society and all these things. And so, but he talks about this idea that we are more, we place, I'm trying to think of exactly how he phrases it because it's better than probably what I'm saying, but he basically we place a higher value on what we want than what we know is right. And so I think in looking at this, I think that's very much what this instruction is speaking to, is that we do have desires and preferences or whatever of things that we want that are not necessarily what is right or what is best for us. And so the Lord is being very clear that there are consequences for that. And with that, there's this. So this is something we actually talked about in my small group this week. My small group is reading a book called Finding Messiah by Jennifer Rosner, who was one of my professors. She was my favorite professor at the King's, and she's a Jewish believer, and she does a lot of work in Jewish Christian relations, different conversations. She's part of several different councils and groups that meet to discuss issues across different faith traditions and things like that. So she has some really interesting stories, and she talks some about it in the book. Some of her journey with that, but this week in our small group, we were reading a chapter where she talks about the Jewish perspective of basically sin and the fall versus a Christian perspective. And many of us grew up in a variety of mainstream Christian churches, Catholic churches, things like that. But on the Christian side of things, which is great, and like, don't hear me putting these are just interesting things. But the narrative, at least, and I very much experienced this as well in my own background, but like the narrative is that the world was created perfect, Adam and Eve sinned, we have the fall, and now it's kind of hopeless. We're kind of like, until Yeshua comes and brings atonement and redemption, we're all kind of slave to sinful nature, and we have to die to that nature and all these things. And that's not all bad, but it's very much this, like, it becomes this almost striving to be good. It's like the goal is the trajectory is toward being good or being perfect or doing all the right things. And of course, we also have the narrative with grace in the New Testament where it's like, well, but you can, there's grace and you have forgiveness. Yes, that's true. But there's very much this mindset develops through theological history of that the goal our goal is to go to heaven. And sometimes then that negates like what is happening here on this earth, especially depending on your eschatology, and much of mainstream eschatology has gotten to a pre-trib situation. We're not going to go down the eschatology rabbit trail, but the mindset I know, I'm sorry. But the mindset becomes like our goal is just to get to heaven. So we want to have a relationship with the Lord, and we want to do all the right things so that we can just be with heaven and we'll leave this world behind. I'm oversimplifying. I know there's lots of nuance to that, but stick with me for a second. Whereas the Jewish mindset, like sin is typically regarded, and this varies depending on, like, I'm overgeneralizing. There are different perspectives within Judaism on this as well. But a common one that has become very popular, especially in the modern age, is like there's this is that sin is like the weight of like sin and evil don't typically have as much weight, and that is a problem in the Jewish perspective as well. But this idea is that the world was created, and this is the perspective that Jen Rosner kind of brings up in her book as one perspective to contrast with the Christian perspective, is that the world was a Jewish perspective is that the world was created good but not yet holy. So the fall happens, and sin is a real thing, like it happens, but then the journey is toward holiness and righteousness. And so keeping the Torah is how we move, is how the narrative, the grand narrative, is moved forward toward holiness unto being able to have relationship and the presence of God. So, and doing righteous acts, doing good acts in Judaism is also is an emphasis. There's a very popular kind of mystical theology in Judaism called Lurianic Kabbalah, and you don't need to deep dive into that. But basically, there's this idea. You may have heard some of this. Is that there's this idea that this perfect goodness of the world existed, and then with the fall it was fractured, and then the goodness has been spread in pieces kind of in each person and throughout the world, and the goal is to bring all of that back together. So each person carries a piece of this goodness, and we're to bring it back together, and that's what keeping the Torah is doing. Which is a very different idea, right? And that I will tell you that theology is a later development that developed. Actually, it kind of started to gain more traction and develop around the time that we started to see Islam arise, which is interesting. But it's very popular today. Like, I don't know if you've heard of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who has passed away now, but he's a very well known rabbi. He was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom at one time, and he did a lot of writing. And a lot of it is very good, but he has a book even called "To Heal a Fractured World," and it's very much based on this idea that this this goodness has been shattered through the world, and we are to bring it back, and this is how we do that. And he lays that out, and it's beautiful. It's like these ideas are beautiful. I do think it does, under this perspective, does kind of downplay the nature of sin and evil in the world, which is where we need to bring some balance. So I'm not suggesting we hold tightly to either one of these perspectives. I'm suggesting that we can learn from both. And in light of these passages that we're looking at, I think maybe we can find some helpful things in that. Because the benefit of this idea that we are moving from, so this Jewish idea that we're moving from something good to something that is holy, helps us to see that our role and our actions as humans, as people on the earth right now, matters. And that's something that sometimes in some Christian perspectives, again, I know I'm overgeneralizing both sides, but because the goal is just to get to heaven and we're going somewhere else, so we kind of just have to get through this, and this is all going to pass away, kind of downplays the importance of our human action in this age. And so I think the benefit of what we can take from this Jewish idea is that we are part of moving this forward. And that's even part of if you've heard Tom talk about the Kingdom Family Timeline, or if some of you have probably taken the Grafted View course, where we go through this garden to garden historical perspective, this biblical messianic worldview is what Tom calls it, the BMW. I cannot tell you how many documents I have that say something about BMW, and I think it's really funny. But anyway, so it's this idea that we do have the ability to participate with the Lord to move history toward the return of Yeshua and the coming of this new age of a new heavens, new earth, new Jerusalem, where we return to a perfect, and I would suggest holy order. But again, right, like the phrase is like, he makes all things new, he doesn't make all new things. I know that's really cheesy, but it's true, right? Like it doesn't say that everything is just, going away. He's coming to renew creation and bring order and wholeness and fullness and holiness that he had designed initially from the beginning. And so I think shifting some of, being aware that many of us were grown up with some of these perspectives of just this world doesn't matter, or, because we're just going to go be in a new reality, just realizing that some of us have that ingrained in us. I do too. I notice it sometimes coming out in myself, is helpful to instead become more present, being like, the Lord put me on the earth in this age for a reason. And what I do with my life and how I live my life matters. Yeah.
I really want to comment on that, because this is like a big problem, and we're all suffering the impact of it in politics because of the teaching that, we're just passing through, don't be of this world. And so people, apparently a large proportion of the population don't even register to vote. And yet, the Lord's called us to be good stewards of whatever he's given us. And so in this nation, he's given us the ability to vote and participate in the process. And if more believers will and apply our biblical faith to our actions, we can see much better outcomes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that that's a really important application. I think it's one that I see what you're saying. I see that come up a lot, and I think for sometimes the perspective, it's just it feels so hopeless that I think it's almost easier to just be like, well, it doesn't matter. We'll just not really pay attention to it. And but that's not helpful, because we are created to have influence and participate in the world that we're in, even though we are at the same time, right? The tension is that we are called to have a kingdom mindset as well, right? That we are called to live in this kingdom that's bigger than this world, but also what happens in this world matters, and that we are supposed to participate in it.
And then you have the rapture, all the different rapture teams that, we're going to be out of here.
Right. Which is not what most of the historical church believed.
No, not at all.
That's a pretty relatively new theological understanding, and that's a really interesting study, actually. But like I said, I don't want us to go all the way down that trail, but yeah, it does make it makes a big difference in how you look at life and how you look at the world and how you understand the Lord. And so I think it's important that we continue to wrestle through that and look and look at it and be like, wait a minute, what does how I believe, like, because when I read, like, one of the takeaways that I get from the Torah, and that I think is one of the things we're supposed to take from the Torah, is that it does matter how we live and what we do and where we are and who we're surrounding ourselves with and all these things, and not just accepting even the most popular narratives of the day blindly. Now, does that, I mean, and I'm not saying we don't learn from other people. We don't learn, we don't want to become too cynical either. Because I've seen that happen too. Like, I've seen some people become really hardened and be like, I can't believe anybody, even other biblical teachers, so I'm just going to do it all by myself. And I'm here to tell you that just this idea of it's just me and Jesus is a lie. It's not just you and Jesus. It's you and Jesus and other people who are following Jesus.
And I would say we see that thread
Mm-hmm.
throughout Scripture of
For
God
sure.
partnering with man.
Yeah.
Noah, Abraham, David, and then go to Yeshua, the parable of the 10 talents. So what we do with what we're entrusted with does matter.
For sure.
And the other is to, you are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. So I see that thread all the way through.
Yeah.
For sure what
Yeah.
we do matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, since this whole portion starts with when they get into the land,
Mm-hmm.
and so much of the curses are all about things that they're doing that's defiling the land.
Mm-hmm.
So when we bring this in the broader aspect of right now with people like, we're raptured and we're out of here and whatever, it's the Lord loves this land.
Yeah.
And when the land gets defiled, whether it's by flood, by casting people out of it, he loves that land. And several years ago, Rich even did a teaching on stewarding this world,
Mm-hmm.
because the defilement of the land, the disposable attitude that people have about, well, I'm going to heaven
Right.
and this land doesn't, which, or the new heaven and earth are coming down and this world doesn't matter. That was obviously never the perspective
Right.
of the Lord on this, because it was so much about when I bring you into the land and bring forth the fruit of the land. And there's so much about how you act in the land that I put you in,
Yeah.
that the connection between that, and I feel like, especially when you've grown up in another nation without like a heart attitude about the land that the Lord's put you in, you can go, I don't need to vote, I don't need to do whatever, I'll do my however many years here and I'm out of here because I'm going someplace better.
Mm-hmm.
And that from the very beginning, the stewarding of the land
Yeah.
and not defiling what the Lord has given you is huge in here. And if you do defile it, these are curses, consequences, discipline
Right.
of not taking care of what I gave you, because it obviously means something to him.
Right. Yeah, and which goes back to, we talked about it before, this idea, like, over another interesting historical theological study of this, we've developed this separation of the spiritual and the physical, right? Which plays also into, which is a part of the, oh, this doesn't matter, we're going to a different place because the spiritual is better or of higher importance than the physical. Whereas because of, like you're saying, like the Torah and the instruction to Israel and these blessings and curses are tied so closely to the land. And even it talks about in some sections, like, if you don't obey, he won't send land. And when you're in a society that won't send rain on the land. Sorry, I was like, wait a minute, I missed a word. Like when you're an agricultural society that is living in a country that has a decent amount of desert and not a lot of rain, like you're relying on that to survive, right? And so if you don't have rain when you need it and sun when you need it and all these things, it's gonna have direct impact on your life. And we live in a society where most of us are more removed from that. And like, I mean, I'm the first to admit, like, I don't have the mindset of like eating seasonally and things like that, because I go to the grocery store and there's anything I want all year long, right? And so we many of us are removed from this mindset of this direct relationship with the land and that we need it to live. But I think, coming back to this idea, like the spiritual and the physical are very much integrated. And I think that's another one, even for myself. Like, I have to notice, like, when I start to notice that separation, like, no, I have to bring it back together, because they're both important. They're both part of the spiritual and the physical are both important to how we serve the Lord and how we honor him. Let's see. So just going back to this idea that what we do matters. I really like this quote from Jen Rosner's book, Finding Messiah. She says, rather than the hopeless plight of humanity being the driving force, Israel's vocation as the steward and locus of God's holiness moves the narrative forward. Within this creation consummation paradigm, the goal is for all creation to be blanketed with the knowledge of and orientation toward Israel's God. So she's just, again, kind of restating this idea that I like that she frames it as it's kind of this, everything is burning, everything is terrible, sin and evil are overrunning the world, we're kind of hopeless, we're just waiting it out, trying to wait it out, versus this hope of, like, we can move this narrative forward, we can partner with him to bring the kingdom to the earth. So, and like I said, there is this reality too that some of the Jewish perspectives don't deal with sin and evil in a strong enough way, and so I like which those are very real things, and that's why we need Yeshua. And I like how she frames Yeshua as kind of this intersection of this physical, like God inhabiting creation and also being fully divine. And she says, in Jesus, God inhabits creation as a participant within it. The incarnation is God's most scandalous act of engagement with creation, God's full self-revelation, and the means by which humankind can participate in the mending of the world. In Jesus, the God-man, we see both the fullness of divine redemption and the gravity of human vocation. So again, she's pulling back together, and this is something that she teaches a lot. She actually talks about in books when she teaches this to her classes, and I was like, yeah, I remember that. This idea of when she teaches about the separation of physical and the physical and the spiritual, and the way that she does that. So she kind of has this trying to pull them back together. So she's even bringing that back together in Yeshua, which of course is what we need most. Okay, I'll stop there for a second. So any other thoughts on this idea of this kind of different perspectives and how, like, our role that we play in moving this narrative forward, and this idea that we're moving toward holiness and how that impacts our world, and why that kind of makes these, and to me that makes these blessings and curses even that much more important and things like that, because when the world matters, then what happens through these circumstances happens too. Did you have something?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the curses. So I was listening on the way here. When you were coming, it's so much longer. It's like, what if there were no curses?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how would we know?
Right.
The standard. How would we know what to avoid? How would we know? And then there wouldn't be that relationship of seeking that out. Everything in life is not written right here. We have to seek that
Right.
relationship with God and I to know, and I mean, back then and now. You know, so I was just, yeah, there's a lot more, but there's a lot that we can do.
Right. There's a lot of instruction through it, right? I think
Yeah.
I think it was Lori was bringing up even that like we learn a lot more about what sin is.
Yeah.
And if we don't know what sin is, then we don't know. Like you're saying, it's like if we only have the good and the positive and the blessing, then we don't have a definition of sin. And I think that that's something we actually see in our current world as well. Is that because especially like that's one of the dangers of having a perspective that the Old Testament, the Torah especially, is not significant, or it's just, oh, that's fun historical background, but the New Testament is where we live. The risk of that is then how do you know what sin is? Right? Like the Torah is how we know what sin is. Yeah.
And I agree. It does talk about that in the New Testament,
Yeah.
in Romans.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder. I had the thought of how much. I think a lot of the balance might be found in the Lord's Prayer,
Mm-hmm.
because it talks about first of all it leans on God as provider, and talks about not being in temptation, and the necessity for forgiveness, and not only forgiveness for ourselves, but for ourselves to forgive others
Right.
as well. Like if we want that grace extended to us, we also have to extend it towards others. I mean, part of I think, so I grew up kind of in a denomination that was really anti getting political, and I no longer really fully agree with that
Mm-hmm.
stance. At the same time, I do think there is a danger in the polarization, because I think it causes people on both sides of the aisle to hate each other, and to not have a desire to to win people and have mercy and humility, recognizing their own sins. I think it's really easy to ignore the sins of one side that you're for if you're against the other side.
Yeah.
Whereas I think political history shows that the sins of one side are essentially overreactions to the sins of the other side in a certain sense.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, talking about how we operate in that space, we also need to keep in mind of people as individuals who have the potential to be, within the family of God, within the family of Yeshua. And so long as we don't lose that mindset, and so long as we keep the humility to have grace and to not be hypocritical, because one of the strongest impacts that you can have on the world is to be a hypocrite.
That's true.
That's a great way to turn people off to
Right.
anything.
Right.
So long as we keep those elements in mind, I think that will direct how we act. It's not a misaction. It's not don't act. It changes how you act towards other people as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Yeshua addressed that, in saying that the day would come that some people would think they were doing God a favor by killing you, but on the other hand, and as we see that with Islamists right now in spades, but on the other hand, he taught us to love your enemies and pray for those who deceitfully use you, and sometimes that's really hard, but that's still
It weighs. Yeah, I think that's the hardest part of Christianity in some ways.
Yeah, I just kind of to that point of what you brought up about this goal of holiness, that God's moving us forward. I believe that is so true. Yeshua says that his prayer sanctified it in the truth. Your word is truth. So he knows how we can get off track because we have an enemy. Mm-hmm. And another scripture, a word that comes to mind is he who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. So he knows if you do not go his way, you will become corrupt. You will open a gate to the enemy. But if you follow my words, you'll be safe, and you'll be much off, basically.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and as you were talking, I just was reminded of well, kind of from this whole discussion, because I think what you said about like being a hypocrite has a great impact on the world. I think the counterpoint of that, and then this all connects to my brain. I'll see if I get there. But I think that the flip side of that is also the humility to repent and to acknowledge when you're wrong, or when you're hypocritical, or you have sin, or whatever. Which goes back to this holiness idea, because, and we had a really interesting discussion about this in my small group. And I think this is another really good thing that to remember is, I think that we think holiness and we think perfection, which is true. That's right. But also, like, remember, like, because remember, right, like, this is back to, I can't not bring up Leviticus again, but like going back to Leviticus, it's like, right, the whole goal of Leviticus, right, is God instructing his people how to be a holy nation so that a holy God can dwell in their midst, right? It's about relationship. But also think about some of the instructions in the Torah, and we see it in Deuteronomy too, but it's like, but there's this, and you are you're supposed to do all these things, but if you wrong your neighbor either by accident or on purpose, this is how you make restitution, right? This is how you then return. So even within, I think this is fascinating. This is what's amazing about the Lord to me. Even within this instruction about holiness, he's like so kind to like give the way for repair when you do something wrong. Because he's not the God of like, oh, you screwed up, you're out. Or you screwed up, I'm leaving. That's not how he is. He's like, okay, you screwed up, and then you have to come back. And it takes a lot of humility to do that, right? It takes a lot of humility to admit that you've done something really wrong. And an interesting parallel, or an interesting example of that we came up in how that it, and the impact that it can have on our relationships and the world around us, is that we were talking about even like characters in books, movies, TV shows, whatever. Like the character that's seemingly perfect, you typically don't trust them, right? You're like, they're hiding something. They're just living in they're living in a bubble. They're living with they see the world with rose-colored glasses or whatever. Like you don't really trust the person who seems to have no issues and seems perfect. But the character that has had like some great failure or like really screwed up and taken the steps to, work on their own issues, repair the relationship, whatever the case may be, that's your favorite character. Like the one who comes back from destruction, who comes back from the really low place, like that's probably your favorite character, and you're like, I can stick with them forever, right? Mm-hmm. And like I think about my own relationships and people in my life, it's like, like I'm not saying I don't trust people who don't seem to don't seem to have major issues, like whatever. But you know what? Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Is it's like the people who have who are humble and teachable enough to recognize their shortcomings and their downfalls and work to come back to a place of restoration or to correct issues or generational things or whatever. Like you like cheer for those people, right? And I think that is like in line with the Lord's heart, because again, going back to like, he knows that we're human. Like I like this. He's very practical. Like he knows that we're human. He knows that we live in a world of sin and destruction, and that we've been seeing all this, and yet the kingdom is here, and so we are capable. Because that's the other thing is like, I think sometimes I get this way. I can get on a mind, a train of thought that's like everything is terrible. Like there's no way that any of this could ever be good again, right? But so then it's like why does it matter? But and this is part of next week's portion. I'm sure we'll talk about it again next week. But in Deuteronomy 30, 11, it says, "For this mitzvah, these commandments that I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it far off. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who will go up for us to the heavens and get it for us and have us hear it so we may do it. Nor is it across the sea that you should say, who will cross over for us to the other side of the sea and get it for us and have us hear it so we may do it. No, the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart to do it." And so I always like to come back to that, because it's like this idea, it's like, it's not too hard. What he's asked of us is not too hard. Do we need him to do it? Yes, but that's the point. Right? We can't do it on our own. We can't do it without community either. Again, going back to my statement of like, it's just me and Jesus doesn't really work out, right? Like, you actually need community, because you need people to see your blind spots. You need people to encourage you when you're struggling to have the ability to be obedient or keep walking the path the Lord has set before you. You need people to cheer you on. You need people to correct you when you're wrong, right? We need all of that. And we need the Lord to be in the midst of all of that too. Like, we hear the Lord through other people a lot, right? And so I like this idea, like because like we were saying, like, you read all these curses and it sounds so terrible and it's so disheartening and it's so like, could God really do that? And yet he promises that it's possible to be obedient and therefore to have the blessings that come with that obedience. So anyway, so in that sense, we have the ability to help make the world a better place. Yeah.
So I'm pulling on this thread that Shane threw out there. What if there were no curses?
Right.
Okay, so I'm going all the way back to the first disobedience. You were in the presence of God in the garden. You get kicked out of the garden. Then we see how, even though they don't talk about blessing and cursing outside the garden, you see that it just got so bad that the Lord was like, he was grieved, he created them. Okay, so now we've got this like reset.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm going to dwell with you again. Dwell with you in the garden. Now I'm going to dwell with you again. But let's set up some guidelines here so that I don't have to, like, kicking out of the land should also be in their memory, thinking of being kicked out of the garden, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this separation thing going on here. These blessings and these curses, or the curses, is like warning signs that things are going wrong here. Let's think about what happened during the flood. Let's think about what happened about being ejected out of the Garden of Eden. When it says that, like you made the comment when I was first coming in about rejoicing in these curses, the fact that he can give them warning signs now.
Yeah.
Like, if you're starting to see this stuff happen, you guys have really messed up here. And this is a warning sign that, like we see by the time of Jeremiah, I'm not going to live here with you anymore, and you're not going to live here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so going through all this, I feel like are more than consequences. They're like warning signs.
Yeah, that's good.
Of how can I stay with you guys here? I really want to give you this, but if you're not, I want to give you these wonderful blessings, and I want you to live in the land, and I want us to live in this community of relationship with me. And when you guys are following after, because most of these practices and stuff is following after the pagan ways.
Right.
These are all warning signs that you're separating from me.
Are we to see curses and consequences as the same thing?
That's a good question. I would say, I think in this, I think they are used as consequences.
Well, there are consequences for doing things right as well.
Right. Those are called blessings. So yeah, I think the way they're framed here, I would say yes. I would say curse and consequence is the same as negative consequence. I was waiting to see
He's
what.
pondering.
I was waiting to see where that went in his brain next. But Lori, what you were saying about this warning signs, which I think is a really good way to see this, and especially like when you look back at the Leviticus curses and the way that they are progressive, like those should be warning signs, right?
Mm-hmm.
They should. That one's really clear, because it's basically like if you do this, then this will happen, and if your heart turned back, we're okay. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. This is the Emma paraphrase. And then, but if not, then this is going to happen, and it goes in levels, and this is not laid out quite that way, but I think it serves a similar purpose. But it makes me think of going back to like kind of circling back to like even at the very beginning of this portion when it talks about them bringing basically their first fruits and their tithes, that part of the response about that is to remember Egypt, right? It's to remember, and this is back in chapter 26, second part of verse 5. They're to say, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt and lived there as an outsider, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and numerous. The Egyptians treated us badly, afflicted us, and imposed hard labor on us. Then we cried out to Adonai, God of our fathers, and Adonai listened to our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. Then Adonai brought us out from Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now look, I have brought the first fruits of the soil to you that you have given to me, Adonai. And it goes on to talk about the rest of the offering the first fruits. But I think part of this, the reason, and this summary is of course pointing toward the faithfulness of God and the mighty acts of God, which is a very important part of it. But it does talk about how the Egyptians treated them, that they were enforced hard labor and all these things. And so I think, again, like remembering of that narrative is to serve as a warning, right? Of like, hey, this was not good. And God was faithful because they were following him, and they had, and at that time, Moses played a really big part in that they were willing to follow the Lord. And so he brought them out. And so going back to, so then we have all this blessing and curse stuff. And then we come back to the end of this portion, in the beginning of chapter 29, Moses called to all Israel and said to them, you have seen all that Adonai did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and all his servants and all his land, the great trials that your eyes saw, those great signs and wonders. But to this day Adonai has not given you a heart to know, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. I led you 40 years, this is Moses speaking, I led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn out on your feet. Bread you have not eaten, wine and strong drink you have not drunk, in order that you may know that I am Adonai your God. So this is Moses speaking on behalf of the Lord. But anyway, but it's this whole idea of like, he remembering Egypt should serve to remind them that God is faithful to do what he says, right? And we've seen like this whole wilderness narrative of the Lord really building relationship with them, of meeting their basic needs first and foremost, to the extent that their clothes and shoes are not wearing out, then they're miraculously being fed every day. And they have this rock that follows them around and gives them water, which I can't wait to have the rest of that mystery explained someday. But anyway, like he has been faithfully with them, and that's the reason. And he's also shown them consequence for, like, when the spies went in the land and brought back the negative report, and they're like, we're not going. He's like, all right, then you're going to spend 40 years out here. Mm-hmm. And this initial generation's not going to go in. So they've seen really this blessing and curse thing is not really a surprise. Like, they've seen him act this way. Like, these might be more extreme because as they grow as a nation and as their responsibility maybe of this nation as a light to the rest of the nations and living in the land that the Lord has promised them and all of these things, their kind of level of responsibility is growing as they grow in some sense, that it starts to get a little bit, the consequences on both sides get bigger. But I think that it just goes back to this, like if they remember their history with the Lord, then I think the Lord's hope is that it makes them be faithful and to remember that He has been faithful, so that they will remain faithful to them. But He also knows the hearts of man, and that
Keeps them humble,
yeah,
independent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same for us.
Right.
We remember from where we came.
Yeah.
Keeps us more humble.
Yeah. And I think even like the description of Egypt, of that Egypt was bad. I think they have to remember that, right? Because that's one of their struggles in the wilderness. Is like, we had all this food, everything was great. No, it wasn't. You were slaves. And like,
You cried out to me for a reason.
right? It's like you wanted to be rescued for a reason. Yeah.
I think another distinct thing to note with the blessings and cursings is how quick the Lord was to bless the nation when they were doing right, and how much patience He had before cursing them,
Right.
when they started to go on the wrong path.
Right.
Going back to, He is a merciful God. He will give many chances to do this, but
Right.
the consequences will come
Right.
if they continue down that path.
Yeah.
Because He wants to bring them back.
Right. Right. And also, like at this point, He has given them all the instruction. Like he has set the expectations, right? He's given, like it's like with children, right? Like you can't expect them to behave or follow the rules if you don't tell them the rules and give them the expectation. Like disciplining a child when they don't know what's expected of them is unfair, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's a similar thing here. It's just that we've seen this. I like to frame the interactions of the Lord with the Israelites through the wilderness as very much like a father raising children type of situation. Because when they come out of Egypt, they've never been not in slavery, right? They've never been their own nation with their own kind of like developing their own governing structure and trying to follow the Lord without being under the oppression of these other people. So it's a new thing. So the Lord the Lord's really kind in how He brings it through and gives the instruction and kind of builds trust and builds His record of faithfulness with them. And so I think, yeah, like when we get by the time we get here, it's like this actually just makes sense, right? It's like, okay, I've given you the instructions of how you live so that I can remain in your midst. We now have some history of this is what happens when it's going well and you follow what I'm saying, and this is what happens when you don't. And so we're going to keep going, and we're going to continue to see that. And we see that through the rest of Scripture. We see it through the rest of history, right? We see this happening, especially like when we get into some of the things with the kings, which are the kings, that was not God's first choice for them to have a king, right? But He knew they were going to want to have a king. And so like, all right, if you're going to have a king, then this is how it has to go. And then we watch all the kings come, and the ones who do what He said, it goes pretty well. And the ones who don't, it goes real bad. So we see it play out, yeah.
So in any relationship, you have some sort of agreement. You could call it a contract, you could call it a covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Lord made His covenants with us over time, and here are the terms.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so I think it's, like, that's why I think it's, like, the more I read Torah, I'm like, this framework that, the God of the Old Testament is just this God of wrath. I'm like, He's very clear. Like, it's actually, like, he's not trying to play games with people. And He's still not, like, he's not trying to, like I said, like, He's not trying to make you guess what you're supposed to do and what you're not. He's actually pretty clear about it. And so, so I think, I think we even see that in the New Testament as well. Like we see blessings and curses and consequences and all these things. And so it doesn't go away because the character of God is consistent. Even though we're moving through time and we have some kind of progressive things that are happening, His character is the same. And I think to see the continuity of that is vitally important for how we read the Bible and how we understand God and how He interacts with us even in the modern age. So it is time to And so I know, here we are. That was,
Thanks for filling in, Emma.
yeah, thanks for hanging with me. It was my kind of my last minute. I wasn't planning to lead this week, but I'm also leading next week, so we'll continue the conversation then. So Lord, we thank you for, again, we just thank you for Shabbat. We thank you for the opportunity to come together and to discuss your word and to learn from the Torah and to see your kindness demonstrated through your relationship with Israel and the Jewish people. We ask that your presence would be with us in service. We thank you for this opportunity to be together to worship as a body of believers. And yeah, we just ask for Shabbat rest to come to each person in whatever way they need it, Lord. B'Shem Yeshua.
Amen.